Hi, we are Team Stubborn Optimists. Thank you for having us. Connecticut has the opportunity to promote and nurture green energy and clean tech startups. Startups in this industry tend to face challenges of raising capital and locating resources needed to remain operational. We have a vision of building a community that will help accelerate the growth rate of scale for renewable energy. Through a community-based approach, we believe Connecticut Green Bank can take green energy investing to another level. Today, we propose the creation of Green Vision Labs, a startup incubator and a strategic investment fund dedicated to clean tech and green energy. Green Vision Labs will have two primary divisions, the first being the startup incubator. Members of the incubator will have access to Green Vision Labs resources such as industry events, advisory from a knowledgeable staff, and an opportunity to utilize office or working space. The second division is the strategic investment fund. Through a structured due diligence process, our team will make successful investments within the clean tech and green energy space. Within the first year, we picture a 5-member staff, 10 incubator companies, and over 30 events. The events will focus on education, as well as building a community around green energy. We have identified 4 ingredients to ensure a successful launch. The first, partnering with Yale to secure operating space. New Haven is the midpoint location between the 2 Connecticut Green Bank offices. Also, Yale has a wonderful environmental studies program that will allow us to source talent. Next, financing of $1 million for launch, as well as additional funding annually to help support business operations. Next, marketing. A marketing strategy that will begin 6 months prior to launch, just to gather interest. Last, a team of knowledgeable staff that has expertise in green energy. This team will be led by Bert Hunter.
Good choice.
Green Vision Labs will have a diverse portfolio of revenue streams, which include annual membership fees, as well as incubator application fees. As mentioned, members will have a chance to utilize office or workspace at a subsidized rate. Also, there will be events at our incubator, therefore we can charge a fee to non-members. Thinking about a couple of financial considerations, first we'll start with costs. We're foreseeing $650,000 in startup costs and $740,000 in average annual operating costs. Both of these costs are driven by personnel, building, and equipment expenses. Moving over to revenue, we will start to see investment returns starting in 2022. This is driven by our profit sharing agreements, as well as returns on our equity positions. Therefore, we should see profitability starting in years 4 and 5, which is 2024 and 2025.
And for GBL to become successful, we know that there's several challenges that we must face. And talking about specifically the incubator, well, obviously, since it's going to be a new entity, there's going to be low awareness from it. So what are we going to do about it? It's basically create this robust marketing strategy in which basically we're going to focus on telling these potential startups on what are the key differentiating factors of GBL. In addition to that, we will be organizing multiple competitions to grow or to build more buzz and generate awareness about GBL. When talking about the investment arm, obviously the important thing will be to be able to identify those companies with great potential, and that will be through the due diligence process and the managing team. But also it will be interesting because what we propose is to create revenue in the long and short term by doing a mix of equity investments and also profit sharing. In addition to this, obviously the idea is to invest in diversified types of companies, not only early stage, but also established companies. And finally, doing partnerships with multiple partners such as the government, other investment funds, and that will help us out. Now, we believe that GBL will be very successful and it will impact positively on 4 different stakeholders. One of them being customers, because as the startups bring the products to the market, obviously the customers will benefit from having access to affordable energy. In addition to this, capital providers, they will see in GBL a reliable partner with great success stories, so they will be more willing to invest money in these startups, and obviously that would be great, and that it will also bring revenues to that. Finally, also policymakers, they will be happy to see that there's a lot of growth happening in the local community, and they will be willing to further incentivize clean tech energy in Connecticut and beyond. And with contractors, since they will be helping to carry out all the growth and the scaling of the startups, then they will be basically winning new business. That would be great. So now we're going to dive deep into Inclusive Prosperity Capital and how we see the brand building there. So usually most organizations, they only focus on the messaging and visual design, but there's other aspects to take into consideration. Obviously the people, so IPC must bring in people that really align with the values of IPC so that they can continue to build the culture and attract talent in the future. With interactions, what we're talking about is just making sure that you're inclusive with all the stakeholders, that you're bringing everyone together to build upon all these projects that you want to implement. With organizational strategy, basically it's just making sure that you have your mission, your vision, your growth plan, but then that you also are able to adapt to the changing business and consumer needs. And finally, communication tools, which is basically just having the right channels to reach your target audience.
So as we thought about how IPC could approach scaling, we looked to some work from the Boston Consulting Group, which identified 3 paths for nonprofits to scale: steady state, ramping up, and accelerating. Based on IPC's business plan and its plan to double its staff over the next 2 years, we think it's ripe for the accelerating strategy. So BCG went on to identify several components that are important for a successful acceleration strategy. The first, a robust brand you just heard about. The next 2 are investments in capacity, capabilities, and people, and credibility with partners. IPC is in the really fortunate position of already having these by nature of being associated with CGB. The last 2, healthy morale and ability to provide intensive support to new sites, get to some bigger questions about readiness to scale more broadly. So to that end, we proposed a 4-step process for IPC to strategically assess its readiness to scale. When we looked at the IPC business plan, we saw that a lot of thought had actually been given to strategies, tactics, and partnerships for scaling. But what we thought was lacking was a plan for prioritizing that scaling. A nonprofit can't approach too many things at once. So how are you going to decide where to scale first versus where you need to invest a little bit more before expanding? So the first phase of this process will involve gathering data on the programs as they exist currently and synthesizing this data to form the basis for a strategic plan when scaling is implemented. Armed with this data, the staff will assess each program on 6 dimensions, each of which have indicators that will be rated on a 1 to 10 scale. So to support this effort, we've created a tool for IPC to assess each of these individual programs. The content here comes from that same BCG article, but we've turned it into a tool to make it more actionable for IPC. So there are 6 dimensions that will be assessed. The first is, have you earned the right to grow? Do you have an impactful program, and do you know based on the data that you actually are making an impact? Have you identified KPIs? Do you know how you're going to measure success? The second is, do you manage costs effectively? Do you know what your costs are now? Do you know how they're going to change moving forward? Are the conditions for success in place? Is there a demonstrated need for this program in this community? Can you fund the growth? Have you identified a revenue stream to support increased costs in the future? And have you built in a 20% or greater buffer for unexpected costs? Do you have the right leadership and people? Do you have a mix of people on your team who are visionary and detail-oriented? Do you have the support of senior leadership? And finally, is your organization model scalable? Are you operating in a way that allows you to go to new geographies? Are you taking advantage of technology? Are you ready to go beyond perhaps a more individualized model? So armed with this data, the IPC should assess the portfolio of programs as a whole. So looking to each individual assessment, which are scoring really well and are therefore ready for scale and expansion sooner, and where are there areas that need to be beefed up a little bit before they can become more scaled. So the way we defined that was if something scores a 6 or below, we consider that sort of low performing and the need to implement a strategy to strengthen that indicator before moving forward with that program. Considering the portfolio as a whole, IPC can develop a prioritized scaling strategy that will allow them to implement their programs to a more diverse and wider audience. So with this portfolio of Green Vision Labs and Inclusive Prosperity Capital, we believe that Connecticut Green Bank is well positioned to lead financially sustainable and inclusive green energy adoption in Connecticut and beyond. And with that, we'll be happy to take your questions.
Thank you.
Sure. Wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. And the visuals were amazing. I wish I could get my staff to present. My question is around the innovative approach of Green Vision Labs, and where will you target funding for that? And I think you mentioned 2022 getting to, in terms of getting contracts from the governments and things of that nature, and how do you get to that period of time trying to get a start?
Absolutely. Do you want this or do you want that?
Yeah. So pretty much we're seeking help from Connecticut Green Bank, of course, with the initial investment. And as you can see in the pro forma, we do have allocations in there. And this is just within the first 5 years to get us running. I think as far as the years 2021 to 2025, the actual operating expense kind of nets close to zero. But we will be able to see investment returns starting in 2022. And that kind of comes with the profit sharing agreement, because we know if we do just rely on equity stakes, we might not realize any gains. So I know startup companies wouldn't necessarily like to do profit shares, but maybe the more mature companies targeted in the space might be open to that if they need some capital from us. And that's pretty much what we're looking for. And then as far as the gains and equity stakes, we're just thinking, hoping our MD our team of managing directors can, pick some good investments for us and eventually get us there.
So I have a lot of questions.
That's good.
But one, I want to thank you for a very thoughtful presentation. The company I come from, we've started a lot of these types of labs and also developed competitions. So when I was reading about this, it really sparked some interest. You talk about in your written presentation about the Somerville, Massachusetts Greentown Lab. Do they charge fees? And if so, what are the benefits? How does that compare to what you're doing? Also, when you think of these incubator spaces or these labs, the probability of success, especially when you're going into equity stakes into companies, it's like shooting hoops. It might hit, it might not. But since you're starting so early stage, you might end up with a lot of failures. So what was your thought process around all of this, when you were thinking of this lab space? And then I'll throw in one more question. When I'm looking at your financial projections, you're showing profitability because of the Connecticut Green Bank allocation. But when you strip that out, there really is not profitability. So at what point will there be profitability, and what is the net present value of all of this?
So I can start. I think I got it. So starting with Greentown Labs. So yes, they do charge a similar fee structure. We actually benchmarked against them to come up with our fee structures. And they've been incredibly successful. I used to live in that community, and seeing the growth they've had over the last 8 years has really been tremendous. So they do a similar mix of membership fees and separate space fees, office space, but then also workshop space, because we know that companies working to build technologies need actual lab space. They're building prototypes, they need places to iterate. So that's why we've broken it up to be both office and workspace. I forgot the second part.
Probability of success.
Probability of success. That's definitely something we thought a lot about, in part because as we looked into the data, we've seen that there's been a real drop in investments in green tech, in part because the returns are not at the VC level. So that's where we thought that Connecticut Green Bank was actually uniquely positioned to invest in this space through Green Vision Labs, because as a sort of quasi-private public entity, they don't necessarily need the same returns that a VC does, but there's still a desperate need for this capital. So that's where what Joe mentioned about a mix of profit sharing and equity sharing with both established and new companies. So yes, we'll probably have more failures in the new companies, so the members of GBL. But if we're balancing that with profit sharing and equity stakes in more established companies, maybe more like Series B or Series C, then we can yield some returns from those companies to offset the losses. And then Joel, what do you think of the last one? The investment from
Break even and net present value.
Yeah. Yes, unfortunately we haven't done the net present value, but as you mentioned, it's kind of like shooting a hoop, right? the probability of success is pretty low, but we hope to eventually make that shot and eventually, hit a home run and get a huge return.
Yes, Ralph.
So as talented as Bert is, you're really talking about two brand new businesses. One is a real estate business, which is the incubator, and the other one is a venture capital. You're talking about getting in B and C rounds of very high potential companies with staff of commercial bankers. No offense, but it's really, really different. And so I'm just curious the extent to which you've thought about the strategic fit of a real estate company, a leasing company, and a venture capital firm being spawned by a commercial bank.
Sure. I can start. I guess we weren't thinking about it as the real estate being completely separate because there's so many examples of accelerators and incubators that are offering space for startups. It's a great point though, and so when we suggested that the managing director sort of report into Bert, they might have a very different skill set than what typically exists within Connecticut Green Bank. So it may be that there is more value in bringing at least one of those managing directors in to have more of a background in a venture capital space compared to a commercial banking space to sort of balance out the skill sets within the team. But I think it's a very fair question. I don't know if you guys want to add anything about sort of those two different business models.
Matthew, Matthew, then Bert.
Sorry, go ahead. Please go ahead.
Bert, was that a comment based on the last question?
No.
No, go ahead. Matthew.
So I think there's first off, thank you. Great work in such a short period of time, and I think there's a common theme to a lot of these questions. As I look at GVL, and then I look at one of the pages in your appendix that has, almost 10 competitors, largely in the Northeast. I guess I'm wondering how you would frame the competitive attractiveness of coming to GVL, and wondering what the universe of quality startups that you might attract versus going to Boston or here in New York, or even within an hour flight, there's probably another half dozen we can add to this list. And then second to that, you talk about the super high risk nature of this, and you talk about the desire to be catalytic. Did you think at all about maybe using IPC as as the foundational or nonprofit sort of catalytic capital around trying to do something like this?
Sure. So I guess starting with the latter, we didn't necessarily think about IPC as the accelerator because IPC is so focused on low and middle income consumers, and we thought that the reach and potential of GVL was so much broader. It's certainly something that could be considered. It's just not the way we had been thinking about the proposal. In terms of competition, yes, there's quite a bit in the space in New England in general. There's a lot of startup activity happening. But we really saw a unique white space in Connecticut specifically for a company to come in and be very focused on Connecticut and growing businesses in Connecticut and keeping them there. So similar to what Greentown Labs and Mass Challenge have done in Massachusetts, a lot of those businesses do stay and retain the talent. So compared to some of these others, we would be looking to build more of a community in Connecticut. You looked into it a little bit more.
Yes. So to add upon that, what we saw is we're phrasing it as competition, but then we were talking about partnership, right? So what we saw, for example, with Connecticut Innovations is that they are doing some investment in clean tech space, but it represents basically a very low percentage of their total investments. So that's what Vanessa was talking about, is we see this white space to have the GVL just focusing on clean tech space, and basically if you partner with Connecticut Innovations, they could be the pipeline, like if they see any interesting company, they could tell us about it, and then GVL might look into it because they have the expertise. And same with other of these that are being shown, they sometimes also focus on just investing in specific regions. So then that's why we thought that just focusing on Connecticut, and then Connecticut being, it's considered now the fourth state with most innovation, according to Bloomberg. So that was interesting. So there's definitely a lot of opportunity there.
And I think finally the location near Yale creates a real opportunity to build more of an innovation cluster in this area. I've done some work in that area in the past, and in order for an innovation cluster to pop up, there really has to be a university at the center of it. And when we think about the location of a lot of these other incubators, they're not taking advantage of that proximity to that talent pool. So we think locating near Yale, where there's a fresh crop of highly educated, really talented new entrepreneurs every year, that's a real opportunity space for GBL.
Bert, you have the last word.
No, my question was covered.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.